Folks, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here this evening. My name is Ken Rosenthal. I'm a park naturalist with Gulf Branch Nature Center. I just want to make sure everybody's aware that we are recording this program, and I hope to put a recording up later on YouTube. So if you don't want to be heard or seen on the video, be sure to keep your camera and mic off. That said, if you do have questions as we're going through, please feel free to interrupt and catch my attention. I find that often it's easier to answer a question in the moment that it's that you have the question than to wait until the end of the program and then either we've forgotten or we're not able to capture that moment. So again, right now it's just a small group. So again, please feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I am going to share my screen and start the presentation. And we are going to talk about some turtles. Oops. Let me try that again. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So we're going to talk about turtles. I really enjoy turtles. I have a special connection with them because it was my father's favorite animal. I've always really enjoyed talking about turtles, and I find them to be quite interesting, considering how ungainly or slow they're often, they often seem or they're often portrayed to be. But they do have some pretty unique adaptations that help them survive and make it through. And obviously, they couldn't be as slow or even sometimes as unwitting as they are portrayed in things like cartoons, because they've been around for a very long time and have been quite successful. And as I said, I think that turtles always can spark a little bit of imagination, a little bit of excitement in us. We can see many different examples of turtles, in popular media, from things like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to some of the old cartoons from Warner Brothers and Hanna-Barbera that have a lot of turtle characters. So let's go ahead, take a little closer look at where we are in the tree of life. Turtles are animals and chordates. They have backbones, obviously. They're in the class Reptilia, so they are reptiles. And their order is Testudines, and this includes all turtles, whether it's sea turtles, whether it's land turtles such as tortoises, all kinds of different turtles. Around the world, and this actually caught me off guard as I was preparing for this. There's only 320 species of turtles found throughout the world. They're found on every continent except obviously Antarctica, which is simply too cold for them, and the waters around Antarctica. But otherwise, you'll find them in most of the oceans and seas around the world. Again, on every continent. In North America, we have about 66 species. There are 24 that are considered native to Virginia. So we've got 24 species here. And there are, if you look on iNaturalist, it'll actually show 6 species, but I'm not sure about the one single species, but there are 5 that are regularly reported here in Arlington. Excuse me. And I'll actually show you a couple extras. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes here. But I want to take a little closer look at this. Turtles are kind of grouped into 2 main categories, suborders. So you've got the Pleurodira, which are the side neck turtles. So if you look at this turtle on the top, this is a common snake neck turtle, northern snake neck, I believe. And on the bottom here, you've got the Mata Mata, which has some fabulous camouflage. I believe they have one of these either at the rainforest or at the reptile house at the National Zoo, and they're worth a look because they're really just an odd looking creature. But this the shape, the triangles, the extra ridges, the flat shell and the feet all help it be very well camouflaged in water that's full of leaves. So they tend to be in these waters that are under tree canopies where there's a lot of leaves that come in, and it makes them very hard to spot with that background. So it's one very well done cryptic camouflage. And again, the other thing that helps is if you're slow, if you don't move very fast, it's much harder to see you. So animals often stand still instinctually as well. But these are side neck turtles, and what that means is when they pull their head in, instead of pulling it back in, as you'll see, as most turtles do, they actually pull their head back in sideways and lay it in sideways. So it's slightly different. They are a small group of turtles. The majority of turtles are more what we're used to, which are the hidden neck turtles, which pull their head directly back. It folds back in on itself as it comes back in. but it moves back in. And, if you think about their contribution to fashion, the turtleneck, but if you think of how turtles have that folded skin, it looks like that. That's evidence of that pulling back in, or that telescoping of the skin over the head as it folds back, head and neck as it folds back in. So the Cryptodura, the hidden neck turtles, that includes the tortoises, the sea turtles, and our typical pond and terrestrial turtles that you'll find around here in Virginia. This here, the one up in the middle is a Galapagos tortoise. You can see their necks can actually be quite long. We got a common snapping turtle in the upper right, eastern box turtle in the bottom left, or eastern painted turtle in the middle here, and this is a hawksbill sea turtle that was photographed off the Virgin Islands. And different turtles can do it to different abilities. We'll talk a little bit more about how box turtles can hide completely within their shells. Snapping turtles don't have much of that, which is how they get their reputation and why they defend themselves the way they do. Let's move. Oops. Oh, because I clicked off. There we go. Next. There are 3 types of turtle shells. We're going to pretty much stick with the hard shell, which is what we're common, but there are soft shell turtles. These tend to be in river systems. The spiny soft shell is more native to river systems to the west and even north of us. I used to encounter these when I worked in Ohio in the Cuyahoga as it got cleaner, the river that runs through Cleveland, which is why Cleveland was founded where it was. But I don't think we don't really have any soft shells that are native around here. We are starting to see nearby in the Anacostia River watershed. I think they're Chinese softshell turtles, which is non-native. I don't know that they're invasive, but they have essentially established a sustaining population where they are reproducing, so they're seeing them pretty regularly. So if you want to see a really neat softshell turtle, maybe do a little exploring around the Anacostia River there, and you might see some. Again, non-native, but still pretty neat to see. And leatherback is the other type of turtle shell. This is a leatherback sea turtle here. But we're going to stick with the hard shell, which is mostly what we're used to seeing. And I just want to remind everybody that the shell doesn't come off. It is part of the skeleton. It is linked to that body. You are not going to be able to take a turtle shell off of a turtle without essentially killing it. I have had kids, or in programs talk about turtles' ability to get out of their shell, and I'm like, that does not happen. The turtle shell is part of the skeleton. It is directly connected to the spine. I even read a really nice way of describing where they called it an elaboration of the ribs. But these are, you can see right here in the picture, hopefully you're seeing my cursor, but right next to the thumb of the person holding the shell here, you can see that white patch where you can see underneath essentially the skin of the shell, that is white. It is bone, and so that is part of its skeleton. The upper part of the turtle shell is called a carapace, and the lower part is the plastron. Okay, and then these hard shells are also covered in a keratinous layer of scutes. And it's essentially like a hardened skin that covers the shell. There is an actual layer of subcutaneous layer between these scutes and the shell. I believe that aquatic turtles tend to shed them a little regularly. I don't think terrestrial turtles like box turtles really do that. Certainly not that much. I know that frequently find these shed scutes in our tanks with our aquatic turtles at the nature center. So again, the hard shell is made of these bony plates. You can see in this image here, between the 2 hands, this is actually the plastron of the lower part of this box turtle shell that we found. And hopefully you can make out on the image, it kind of looks squiggly, but that's where the plates have come together and kind of fused. It's very similar to what the plates on your skull would look like where they're fused. And again, these, just like our bones, even though it seems very external, just like our bones, these bony plates on the turtle shell do grow with the turtle and get larger. We'll talk more about that because I'll talk about how you can also kind of get a count on how old that turtle shell is. Turtle shells serve as defense. I think a lot of us think of that. They are not impervious. Turtle shells are not going to stand up to getting run over by a car. There's no question which is going to win in that confrontation. Some have a hinged plastron to close front and back. So if you can see on this turtle shell, it's been actually pulled up right to the upper part of the shell. So the plastron has been pulled up and closed against the carapace. This can make it really difficult. Our box turtles do this, the eastern box turtles. Around here, the only critter that is big enough to excuse me, that is strong enough to break that shell is a coyote. Coyotes actually have the jaw strength, excuse me, to crack that shell. So they can actually break that shell open with their jaws. So box turtles don't stand a chance. How often that happens, or how often coyotes will utilize box turtles as food, I don't know. Their main prey tends to be small mammals and rodents. So I don't think they're gonna do a lot of that. Although again, they're also opportunistic, and so it's certainly worth a shot. Not all turtles have that hinge plastron, but they can still retract their arms, their legs, tail, and head in to a degree, and it can certainly help them. As you can see, these turtles here that are basking, they're far more likely to plop back into the water than to try to hide in their shell if danger gets too close. For a terrestrial turtle like a box turtle, which cannot swim, they physically can't swim. The box turtle's in water over its head, it will drown if it's in that water for too long. But they can close their shell. So they can't swim, but they're on land. So being able to close that shell like that is great because they can't duck under the water like some of their aquatic cousins can. Turtle shells are another example of a moisture retaining adaptation. As reptiles are much more have a better ability to colonize terrestrial habitats because they have thick skin covered in scales that helps them retain moisture. The turtle shell is an extension of that can help them retain moisture as well, which is very important. It's also very good to absorb heat while basking. Turtles are ectothermic. They are, the old term for that is cold-blooded. So their body temperature will change with their surroundings, and so it's really important to bask to maintain that temperature. Speaking of basking, let's talk about that a little bit more. You want to raise your body temperature if you're a box turtle. There are things that are difficult or you're simply unable to do if your body temperature is not a if your body is not at a certain temperature. The warmer you are, the more active you can be. This is typical for a lot of ectotherms. It's also important for digesting food. There's a certain temperature where it becomes difficult, or you simply can't digest food if your body temperature is not high enough. So getting out into the sun, which can seem like a scary thing to do, you're sitting there on the sun, you're kind of exposed. But the trade-off is you become more active. You can digest food. It helps in growth. It helps with production of sperm and eggs. It also helps in the metabolizing of essential vitamins. So this is really super important for them to get out there. And aquatic turtles tend to have a flatter shell, which is a little more streamlined and aerodynamic for swimming. But you'll see land turtles tend to be a little domed to maximize their ability to get the absorb the heat from the sun. This can be especially important for a turtle like a box turtle, which might be under a canopy, and so any little bit of sun that they can get is really important. And so having a shell that helps maximize their ability to get that heat and that sun's energy is really important. All right. Some turtles do not come out of the water to bask. Painted turtles do, the one on the right here. Snapping turtles tend to not be baskers, and that doesn't mean that you won't see them basking, but it's not very common. They often tend to bask by getting into the shallower water where they can receive that warmth and heat from the sun without leaving the water. I've heard some people suggest that that snapping turtle might not be feeling healthy if it's out of the water and basking. And I don't know that to be true or not. But I do know that you don't tend to see snapping turtles basking as much. I always get excited when I try to get a picture because you don't see it very often. I almost feel like I've seen snapping turtles out of the water more when they're going to lay eggs than when they are actually trying to bask. But it also can often help to see them more clearly because they do bask at shallower depths like this, where they can absorb that sunlight even through a film of water between them and the sunlight. One other thing, I'm just going to peek ahead. Yeah, one other thing to consider about this. For endotherms who produce their own body temperature like we do, The hot days of summer can be a time where you need to find ways to cool off. And swimming, playing in the water and fooling around, that kind of thing is really, really fun for us. For a turtle, whenever you immerse yourself into that water, you go from being perhaps really, really warm on a log or a rock, to going into cool water, and that water immediately begins to pull some of that body temperature away from you. And so thicker turtles can withstand that longer. Certainly the bigger snapping turtles have more capacity for holding in heat longer than some of the smaller turtles, like the musk turtles, the mud turtles, the painted. Um, but regardless of what kind of turtle you are, when you're in water, water does pull away heat, and so being able to bask before you go in to raise your body temperature enough allows you to be more active under the water while you're there, and also to not cool down so quickly that it's not effective to be under there. And it's not, you will see sometimes turtles even active under the ice, because even a small layer of ice. This is a great photo from one of our park volunteers, David Howe, who's kind enough to share this with me. And they, this is a red-eared slider under the ice, but it's active and moving. You can sometimes see this, especially if the ice is frozen really clear, and you can go to some of these areas where even though it's sunny and it feels cool, the radiation from that sun and ultimately that heat is still helping these critters move a little bit. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's going on there as well, because certainly that turtle might not be doing a lot of eating or digesting, but they will become active and get activated by some of that heat. One other aspect of turtles that's I think people find really, really interesting is their longevity. This is Lonesome George. Lonesome George was a Pinta Galapagos tortoise. Um, one of the fascinating stories I've always really enjoyed, about, whoops, didn't want to go ahead that quick, uh, about Darwin's trip around the world, is when he was in the Galapagos. If and I hope I remember this correctly, I hope this isn't apocryphal, but I feel like I heard this from a really reliable source. He did not do a good job of labeling some of the crates with what island he took them from. And what he figured out when he got back to England and began to look at everything he sent back was that you could tell what island each of the tortoises came from. They had essentially speciated across these islands, because they weren't, just like the box turtle, they're not swimming from island to island. And so they speciated on each island. They were slightly different shell morphology between the different islands. And so he kind of kicked himself for not doing a better job of labeling the boxes that he had brought back. Now we know, obviously, that there is this subspecies. These Galapagos tortoises are there are subspecies on each different island. Well, on Pinta, he was the last one. They found him in somewhere in the 70s, when they thought they were all extinct. To protect him, they brought him to the Darwin Field Station, which is not on Pinta. I think it's on Santa Maria. And he stayed there for the remainder of his life. They estimate that was probably somewhere around, born around 1901, the beginning of the century, and he died in 2002, I think. So he had been. They estimate that he was 101 or 102 years old. This is not uh, a ridiculous or unheard of age for turtles, especially turtles in captivity, which do even better, because there's less predation, disease, food instability to worry about. But even in the wild, turtles can do really, really well with their longevity. There can be some turtles, once they reach maturity, and for turtles it can be a longer time to reach sexual maturity than other species. Some it may take 8 or 10 years before they are sexually mature and able to reproduce. But once they reach that moment, most of them do not reach an age of senescence, or an age when they can't reproduce. And so up until they're they die, they're still able to contribute to the gene pool. I always like to use this as a lesson for people who get really excited and they find a box turtle and they're like, I want to keep the box turtle. We'll take care of it just for a little bit. And I always point out that they don't. It's not easy to find a partner if you're a box turtle out there. And then if you remove that box turtle and say you keep it for small amount of time, or even maybe save it for several years, you could be eliminating several um, mating events for that turtle, and you could be really reducing the population by that because it's not as regular a thing as maybe some other species. And so, but that longevity, certainly helps them maintain populations when they're not being removed by predation from non-natives, or things like the pet trade, where turtles can often be picked up because they're cute. One of the things I think that was really nice that pet stores have started to do in the last decade or so is to be more upfront about the amount of time many of these pets that they sell will live, including turtles. Because I'll talk about this longevity can be be a big problem for some of our native species, because of non-native species that get introduced as a result of the pet trade. But turtles are able to live quite a long time. It's really, really impressive, and I think that's one of the fascinating things about them. And again, this is Lonesome George from the Galapagos, is a really neat turtle. If you look, this is what I was mentioning earlier. You can look at turtles, and oftentimes they will put a ring on their each scoop, so not on the whole shell, but on each scoop you'll be able to count the number of rings to a certain age. Once they reach a sexual maturity, they're not going to keep adding that layers on, and so it kind of stops. But you can up to that point maybe make a determination of that turtle's age. So you want to look at essentially one scoop and count each of those rings, similar to how you would count the rings on a cut tree, to get an idea of how old they are. I feel like I have in my head, it stuck around like 15 years or so is about that age where box turtles have kind of reached the size that they're as big as they're going to get, and they stop putting on those annual rings of growth. But again, it's similar to trees in that they're inactive during the winter, when they are hiding out and brumating to get through the colder months that would not be very hospitable for them. And so that's a pause in their growth. And so you can see that in the shells rings there, as they get older, how many rings there, how many years they've been through, how many growing seasons. Something I think that is not really talked about a lot with turtles is their claws. These claws can actually be quite important for turtles, especially in their front feet. For box turtles around here, you need those front legs and those claws to dig in order to hibernate. Certainly, they can be helpful as well for aquatic turtles who are going to go into, maybe aren't going to dig onto the ground, but are certainly going to dig for um, down into the dirt and the muck in the depths of the pond, to hide themselves in there while during the cold winter months. They also need to dig a hole if they're going to lay eggs. They can use these claws to climb and to bask. I think, for me, one of the most fascinating things about these front claws is I specifically included a painted turtle's front claws here, and I think those might be elongated, but I feel like I've also seen them longer. Um, but painted turtles will use their bright head coloration and their elongated claws to attract a female. And I don't know if you all can see me. I think I kind of stay out on the camera the way they do this, but they will put their legs out in front of the female's face and wiggle um, their their elongated toenails in an attempt to attract her, or entice her, or to coerce her into mating with them. And so I've seen this happen before. I was at Huntley Meadows watching this poor male painted turtle work so hard to get this female's attention, and she couldn't have been more unmoved by his display. Um, I don't know how less interest a female turtle could have shown. And he's just in front of her, and he's wiggling the tails, and she turns to the left, and he swims over, and he's wiggling his feet, and she turns to the right, and he's back there, and he's wiggling. And eventually she just did a 180 and swam off, and the poor male turtle just kind of sat there like, well, that was a lot of work for nothing. So those turtle claws can be really, really important. And again, painted turtles aren't the only one, but it's one of those ones where I've definitely seen it. I know that's how they do it. So um, for a time, they had a small male painted turtle in the indoor pond at Long Branch, and the poor guy had lost his front legs, and so he was never going to be able to do that. Or to dig down in the muck at the end of the year. So that's why he spent as long as he did over there. We have a box turtle that's missing one of its front legs. It cannot dig for that winter brumation, and so it's unreleasable. Um, and so that's why we have at least that box turtle in our collection. Reproduction. I thought this was another fantastic description here. Walking turtles, so terrestrial turtles, may chase, ram, bite. These are the methods they use for coercing a female, getting her attention, saying like, hey, don't you like me, is to chase and ram and bite the female. But that's how they do it. If you are a swimming turtle, again, you might have bright head or other kinds of coloration to attract a female. You can use those elongated claws. And then either way, males often have concave plastron, so they're the bottom half of their shell are often curved slightly upward to make mounting easier. I often do a program where I'll be telling kids the difference between box turtles. We have two male box turtles, and they both have red eyes. Typically, males have red eyes, females have brown eyes. Sometimes you find a male with brown eyes, you find a female with red eyes. What will always tell you the true story is if you look at the plastron. And if it's slightly concave up, that means that you've got a male, regardless of eye color. If it's flat across, that means you got a female. In some species, females are slightly larger. They have a larger dome that helps them allow more eggs. Regardless of the species, that concave plastron is for allowing the male to better mount. Sometimes they have a more muscular tail that'll help as well. In this picture here, this is a couple of snapping turtles. You can see the male has gripped with the front and the back legs. He's gripped the female's tail or shell, and you can see his tail, even though you can't see it. You can see it's obviously in place where they're attempting to where he's attempting to link the cloacas and mate with the female. So and wood turtles, which are typically, I think, a little more terrestrial, though they'll do both. They mate underwater. A lot of the aquatic turtles will mate underwater or in the water as well. So, but snapping turtles are pretty big and they're a little easier to spot than some of our other turtles when they are going through this process. Egg laying occurs on land for all but one species of turtle. This can be a really, really dangerous time in a turtle's life because it's not just important to get out of the water and onto the land. It's important to get far enough up onto the shore if you're at an ocean, far enough away from the pond or the river or the lake if you're a turtle, a freshwater inland turtle, far enough away so that you're above any flooding that can even happen. Turtles lay eggs just like other reptiles. They have a leathery shell, and that leathery shell is permeable to oxygen, and that also means that the eggs inside, or the embryos inside, can be drowned if they get submerged in the water. So these turtles will go through a pretty good journey to find that kind of to find an area that's away from high enough out of the water where they feel that they have a good ability to get out there. When I worked in Reston, the nature center I was at was probably a good quarter-mile or so up the hill from the lake, and occasionally we would find baby turtles in the little pond next to our nature center that had probably come uphill instead of went downhill and ended up in this little pond. When I was a kid, I had a buddy who lived on a street, and he was on the uphill side away from this massive pond behind all these other houses, and that whole neighborhood, the turtles would come out of that pond and go up into those backyards, cross the road into the other set of backyards, and then behind them up into the woods and lay their eggs up there. So they'd have this massive, bunch of turtles coming up to lay their eggs up in the woods. And then after however long it took for those eggs to hatch, all these baby turtles coming back down through their yards, back across the road, back through the closer yards, and then into the pond. Something that happened every year, which sounded really neat to me, and I think they generally tried to enjoy it. But again, it's this arduous journey, and you're not, that painted turtle is much more agile, much more able to move in the water. They can't close their shell like a box turtle, so that's a pretty dangerous journey for these turtles to undergo. And then for the sea turtles, they've got to get on land. It's the only time of their life they come on land. They come on land. They got to dig out the hole. They drop the eggs. They're hoping that nothing sees them while they're doing it because the eggs are tasty for a lot of different critters. They've got to cover it back up with sand. They got to get it back out in the water. They're exposed. It's dangerous, and it's exhausting. It's really, really tiring for these turtles to do all that work. Here's the one exception. This is a northern snake-necked turtle. It's found in Australia. And what the northern snake-necked turtle does is they actually lay their eggs underwater, but they're not going to remain there. So they'll dig a little spot in under the surface of the water in some ephemeral pools or vernal pools. If you're familiar with vernal pools, these are the pools that are seasonally full but will dry up at some point. And so they tend to lay their eggs in these little the small clutch of eggs under the surface of the water. And then at some point, that water is going to dry up as the dry season progresses, the wet season ends. And as that dries up, the atmosphere, when the oxygen from the atmosphere reaches the eggs, that will trigger the eggs to begin developing. And so it's a really neat, I think, an adaptation and a way of using a vernal pool, because turtles just don't lay their eggs in water, except for this one individual. And again, they're not going to stay underwater forever, but my assumption is they're protected under the water. And then as the water dries up, the atmospheric oxygen, the air essentially triggers them to start developing, and the embryos inside are, I guess, activated at this time. And that's really, really a neat adaptation, a way to do it. And again, it's the only species of turtle in the world that we know of that lays eggs. A neat side note to that is this was only formally described in a scientific paper in 1993. So just a little less than 30 years ago, but it's something that was probably known by the Aboriginal Australians for generations prior to that. So it's one of those neat things where it's like they knew, the people who lived there the longest knew that was happening, but it was something that was kind of new to science a little more recently, or formally described in a scientific paper. But that journey for these baby turtles once they hatch is also a pretty dangerous thing as well. So even snapping turtles you think of as these really not. Some people probably think of them as ferocious, but certainly not something you want to be picking up. They can definitely snap, and it's no fun. But a tiny snapping turtle like this, a tiny painted turtle, these tiny sea turtles, they're all bite size for a lot of critters. This is a Galapagos mockingbird, and I got to go to the Galapagos a long time ago. I'm going to make this story really quick, but I think it illustrates a good point. We were out on this beach at night, and we saw these sea turtles hatching. It was so exciting. We're all standing there, and we're watching them come out of the sand, and we're rooting for them. And this mockingbird comes over, stands in the middle of our group, looks up at all of us as if to challenge us, turns around, snags a turtle, and flies off. And we realized we were essentially advertising where those turtles were. So we spread out along the beach, and we're watching it, and we're seeing several spots where these turtles are coming out, and they're heading for the water. But everywhere that those turtles went, there was a lot of critters on them. So I don't know if it's if there's some strategy for the turtles that were successful, or if it was just luck of not getting spotted by something. But there were a lot of predators on there. So at the very end, I think our this is a college group, and we were a little tired of seeing so many critters eat these baby turtles. So we, quote unquote, escorted one down. We stood around it in a circle. There's 6 or 7 of us. We walked down with this little baby turtle in between us, and it got into the wave. We were so happy, and a big frigate bird came by and plucked it off the top of the water and flew away. And so even with our help, once it got in the water, it was a whole different story. So I don't know if any of these turtles I took the picture of actually hatched, made it to adulthood or not, but it's definitely a perilous journey. If you think about the story I was telling about the neighborhood with the pond and the road, this painted turtle's now got to go through 2 backyards, a road to get, and a road, cross a road to get to the big pond where they live in. And so when they're this size, those shells can be helpful, might be helpful, but they might not be as helpful as you think, because they're really snack sized morsels for a lot of critters. A big 30, 40, 50-pound snapping turtle is a far different cry from this guy that probably weighs, only a few ounces. So it's a dangerous time if you're a turtle at that age. Let's come back to winter now. And I think this is really, really neat. If you're a turtle and you're ectothermic, you're cold-blooded, your body temperature changes with the surroundings. As your body temperature drops, so too, one advantage of this is that a lot of your metabolic needs drop as well. The need for food, the amount of oxygen you need, all drop as well. So if you're not moving as much, if you're not as active, you don't need that much food or oxygen. Excuse me, that one snuck up on me. You don't need that much oxygen. And so you can exist under the ice for a much longer period of time, underwater for a much longer period of time than you normally would when it was warmer and you had a lot more metabolic processes. And so the amount of oxygen you can absorb through the skin on your neck, your legs, and inside your cloaca, your urogenital opening, and the lining of your mouth is enough to get you through those winter months. And so there are turtles that will be submerged under the water and even under ice for months at a time that are normally, oxygen breathing turtles, but they're able to survive because they're able to absorb enough oxygen through the water across these skin and membrane barriers, that can help them survive because they just need so much less now, and so that can really be helpful. And I think it's a fantastic adaptation. If you've got kids or grandkids and you've seen Frozen 2, it's one of the facts that Olaf talked about as he's getting older and he learned about is that turtles can breathe through their butt, and it's very true. That cloacal respiration is really important for these turtles, especially if they're aquatic. Box turtles can even use it to a certain extent because they may get submerged by spring floods and rains for hours or even a couple days. I don't know how long they can go without that atmospheric oxygen. But turtles like the painted turtles, the sliders, the snapping turtles, they can all survive under the water for extended periods of time because they have this cloacal respiration where they can absorb oxygen from the water through the lining of their mouth, and the cloacal respiration, through the lining of their cloaca. Here's a diagram of a sea turtle, and if I'm remembering the term correctly, I think these are called bursal sacs. But these two sacs here are connected to the cloaca, which is one. The water comes in here, and as the water flows through here, you can see from this diagram there are a lot of these small filiform or hair-like projections, but all that is doing is increasing the amount of surface area that water is exposed to, and that allows for more oxygen to be taken up. So for a sea turtle, this can be a really big deal for diving deeper and farther and getting further down into the water, being able to find more food, and not having to come up to the surface as quickly or as often, which can be dangerous as well. Even though sea turtles are pretty large, they probably don't have as many predators. Things like sharks can still be a significant predator on even adult turtles. And so this cloacal respiration is really important adaptation for them to survive diving deep. So what I want to do real quick at the end here is talk about some of the turtles that you can find in Arlington, and some of the ones that maybe you can't find in Arlington, but you can find it in other areas around here. And I'm try not to go into too many of my personal stories, but I have some thoughts on good places to see some, if there's some you haven't seen that you would like to. Eastern box turtles are ones you can find in the area. What's interesting is they are considered species of interest. I don't know if they're considered endangered or vulnerable, threatened just yet. It goes back and forth, but I know like if you post a box turtle on iNaturalist, they will not show where that box turtle was seen to other people. You can see on your own, but you can't see where other people have seen the box turtle. So they kind of blur out the exact area because they want to make sure people aren't collecting them. But eastern box turtles are probably our only terrestrial turtle. And you can still find them in our neighborhoods. They are considered common. What I went through the Wildlife of Arlington, a Natural Heritage Resource Inventory technical report, and looked at the turtles that they had listed in there. So those are the ones I'm going to list. Again, you'll see a lot of reports on iNaturalist as well. I did both. And like I said, there's only 5 that were really regularly reported in Arlington. Eastern box turtle is one, and they list the eastern box turtle in this inventory as common in woodland parks and residential backyards. So I want to make sure I give you that status as well here. Another one that's fairly common is the eastern painted turtle. This is another one that is common in remaining deep water wetlands. You can definitely find them in the ponds at Long Branch. You can certainly find them in some of the other big ponds around the county. We don't have those. Our pond at the Gulf Branch has typically been ephemeral. It's usually dried up in the summer, although it hasn't for a couple of years. But the turtles still haven't quite found it yet. But eastern painted turtles are fairly common in some of the water around Arlington. Another one is the common snapping turtle. They also do really well. Again, it's deep water wetlands is where you're going to find them. You can probably find them in Roach's Run. I'm sure there might be some even in the Potomac. I've seen one in the pond right next to Long Branch. And I think you might be able to even see it down the Sparrow Pond. We certainly have these in some of the wetter areas around Arlington. I made sure to find a image of the bottom of the common snap turtle. So you can see here, it's almost like a plus or a cross shape. It's very, very reduced, their plastron. So they are not able to really hide into their shell very well. And so this is why, instead of if they're not in water and they get picked up like this, they will often snap or bite. They have a long neck and they can often reach halfway back of their shell. So you want to be very careful. I've often told people that if you're see a snapper turtle and you're trying to help it move, like if it's on the road or something, grab it by the back legs. Don't grab it by the tail because some of them when they're really big, um, pulling on their tail, pulling the rest of the weight of them with their tail or lifting them. That's a very old school image you can find in some old reptile and amphibian guidebooks. But if you pick them up by their back tail, you could damage their spine by that because they're a really heavy turtle. But you grab the rear of the spine, rear of the shell. See where it's kind of pointy here, which I'm sure makes you feel good about it. But you grab them by the rear of the shell and drag them backwards in whatever direction they were going because you want to make sure they go. You get them, especially if you're clearing them off a road, you still get them to the side that they were heading towards. I netted one I saw in our pond about a year or two ago, and when I was trying to pull them out of the net, I was really surprised, even though I should have known, I was really surprised at how quickly it could snap out. And so you don't want to misjudge that jaw. If you know our natural resource manager, he's very fond of saying that he'd much rather get bit by a snake than a turtle because snakes let go. And the other thing I want to point out, I just noticed it. I didn't notice it before, but it looks like there might even be a leech on the back of this turtle's leg here as well, and that's not an uncommon thing to find. Leeches attached occasionally to the shells or turtles. Northern red-bellied cooter is described as being found here locally uncommon within preferred habitats. They do like the big waterway areas. The most likely spot for one of these around here might be either the Big Beaver Pond over near Fairfax Drive, or certainly Roach's Run is a really good spot. I always like to point out to people that you can, everybody knows about, I think most people know about nest boxes or even aware of like bat boxes, but this was a floating dock that we put out when I was working at Reston that they put out in the pond to give the turtles a spot to kind of sun in the pond and kind of help improve the habitat a little bit for them as well. But it also increased the viewing opportunities for residents to see the turtles that were living in the lakes, which I thought was a really neat piece there. This is a Stinkpot. This is, again, something that you might see in Roach's Run. It's, again, considered locally uncommon. They have collected it in Sparrow Pond and Glencotter Park, Poplar Pond, which is the pond next to Long Branch. And it's thought that they're most likely around Roach's Run and maybe the mouth of 4 Mile Run. They're really pretty turtle. I love the stripes along their eyes. They're really, really neat. Not very big. This is an adult. This one is actually from Huntley, and I did appropriately get spoken to sternly by several visitors that didn't like that I pulled it out to take the picture. They are actually really good at climbing. You'll often see them sometimes on a branch or a stick sticking out of the water, a foot or more above the surface of the water. They are tiny. I will say that I think I've had the most success at seeing them either at Huntley or in the canal at on the Maryland side of Great Falls. If you hike south from the Tavern Visitor Center, I've often seen several along that hike in the canal, which is always fun to spot them. Again, they're not very big, so you got to be a little keen looking. Although I've seen them out sunning once or twice, but they're really, really neat turtles to watch. And if you see them from the canal, if you're standing up above them, often you can watch them hunting and searching with their necks stuck out, poking around looking for food. So they're really fun turtle to watch. Some non-natives. On the left, this is a yellow-bellied slider. On the right, this is a red-eared slider. These are both, the species name is Trachemys scripta. These are sliders, but they're two different subspecies that are found in other areas. There is, this yellow-bellied slider is listed in the inventory, but it's only listed because they are pretty regularly seen at the pond in Long Branch. They are red-eared sliders are a very popular turtle. They are in most aquatic places around here. They are non-native, and they are not, found here. They're found in river systems to the west and to the south of us. But they were made very popular by the pet trade. And this is one of the turtles that I always talk about when I talk about that need for people to understand how long their pet's going to survive. this is one of those critters because they live quite a long time. They can get really, really big, and they can be a pain to take care of. And your son or daughter goes off to college or moves away, and you're still stuck with this big turtle that you don't want to take care of anymore. And a lot of people think, well, I'll just dump it in a pond and it can live out its days there. And what's the harm? And the harm is now we have we have probably um, populations of these guys where they are making their own. They are self-sustaining at this point. There's no longer, the only new turtles that we're getting, the new slider turtles that we're getting is because of people dropping them off. We have new red-eared sliders, especially because they do so well. The same was true when I lived in Cleveland. You saw a lot of red-eared sliders, also not native there. And if you look at the range map and a lot of field guides, you'll see, the river systems where they're native to, all highlighted in whatever the color is for their range. And then you'll see all these patches throughout different areas all through the Midwestern and Eastern U.S. where they have been introduced by people essentially dumping them out, dumping them because they live too long. So, my advice to people is always, if you're gonna get a reptile as a pet, always consider who's taking care of it and how long it's going to be with you. Thought extirpated from the county. On the left is a spotted turtle. I've had a lot of luck finding these at the right time of year at Huntley Meadow. They're very, very pretty. On the that was the left. On the right is the wood turtle, the one in the person's hand. I think there's a spot or two north of us that are good for seeing these, but I also don't think it's open to the public. These are not really common. They are in the state. They're definitely listed, whether it's vulnerable or threatened or endangered. I'm not entirely sure, but you're not going to find them. It's likely you're not going to find them in Arlington. Um, I will say the spotted turtle I would have expected to find in Arlington. Um, One of our volunteers, David Howell, actually sent me a picture. I wasn't able to get the picture in the right size out of the email, unfortunately, to show it, but had spotted one recently in one of the waterways outside, which is really, really exciting, and maybe it's possible. Certainly, it's something that you'll find in similar waters to like the musk turtle or the mud. So there might be a couple of patches of them somewhere. It was really cool to see that picture, but generally, it's not one you're going to find very easily or very commonly here in Arlington. Left is eastern mud turtle. On the right are river cooters. River cooters need they need kind of, I think sometimes what they're really talking about here is a little bit slower water and certainly a lot more vegetation. So they're not easy to, there's not really a lot of good places like that. Maybe the west bank of the Potomac, which would be around Arlington, but likely the west bank of the Potomac south of Arlington, more along Alexandria, is where the conditions are right, where it's a little slower and there's a lot more vegetation for their dietary needs. Eastern mud turtle, we talk about places like Roach's Run being a good possibility. And maybe there's a couple of other patches of wetland we're not sure about. This picture, I'm pretty sure, is taken from Occoquan Bay National Wildlife Refuge, which is down near Woodbridge. If you ever get a chance to go there, I highly recommend it. I've seen spotted turtle, mud turtles, down there. Definitely, I think there are some river cooters down there. Definitely seen some large turtles in the river, though I've never really identified them. The birding and many other critters are really, really exciting. I've seen racers and rat snakes, but getting a couple of different kind of turtle species down there is always really nice. So that's a good place to see them as well. But again, it's possible they're here. We're not entirely sure if there's a good place for them in Arlington. So thanks for hanging out with me this evening. There's a few minutes left here. It's not quite 8 o'clock. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and see if anybody has any questions for me here at the end. Oh, you know what? Since nobody jumped up right away, I do want to recommend. I'm going to take off the effects here so you can actually see the book I'm holding. No effects. Apply. This is a guide to the turtles of Virginia. It's a publication from the Virginia Department of Game and Fisheries, which are not even called that anymore. I think now that's Wildlife Resources. It's whatever it is. But I highly recommend checking out their new website. And they have that book. They have um, snakes and lizards. They have salamanders. They have frogs, which had come with a CD of calls. Um, I don't know if they still have that anymore, but I recommend it. I really enjoyed that calls. But yeah, so the frogs and toads, they have the turtles, the snakes and lizards. They have a bat guide. But the reptiles and the new salamander one, and those are all fantastic. They're really great, and again, they're all done for Virginia, so I highly recommend any of those books. I don't get any kickbacks. This is not a paid uh, solicitation, but I really enjoy those guides, and they have really good information. And again, they're very relevant to where we live. Any questions about any of the information about turtles or anything that I didn't talk about that you would have a question about? Okay. Well, thanks for joining me this evening. I appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me, and I hope you all have a good day. And maybe we'll see you next month. Thanks.